Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have the remaining part of your notes for Chapter 32, Section 2, Africa Post-Colonial Times. And so as we go along, make sure you're getting the information that you need. So let's begin. In the 1970s, there was a coalition of African nations and other countries that had voted to deny South Africa a seat in the United Nations General Assembly. If you're not certain of what the UN is and what the General Assembly is, it's kind of like a Congress of all the member nations of the United Nations. And so by denying South Africa a seat, they didn't have the ability to participate in discussions. A lot of it's dealing with trade and whatnot, but many nations, including the United States, refused to trade with South Africa and imposed what we would call as an embargo or a boycott. And part of that was to hurt South Africa economically, to pressure them into changing the laws of apartheid. The ANC, this is the African National Council that was formed back in 1912. It was a reform movement led by lawyers who encouraged the use of civil disobedience. This is coming out of a period of time when we were seeing some things in parts of South Africa. There was a guy named Mohandas Gandhi, who we're going to hear more about as we get into our notes on on Asia, but he really began a lot of his demonstrations in South Africa, and this group was kind of aimed more for Africans. When you talk about Gandhi, his movement was aimed towards people who were from South Asia or India who happened to be living in South Africa. By the 1960s, the ANC was deemed a radical group by the government in South Africa, and many of its members were arrested, including Nelson Mandela. So, the Soweto Uprising. This was sparked in the 1970s due to a new policy that was going to require black students to be taught in the language of Afrikaans, which is kind of the European language of the Dutch and the British. And many of these black students were upset. They wanted to be taught in their native languages, and they decided to stage a peaceful demonstration, and many of them were beaten, were killed by the South African military or police. Stephen Biko, who we've been hearing a lot about, he was a South African black protester who fought apartheid. He was eventually captured and killed by the police in South Africa, and his death made him a martyr and brought world attention to the struggles against apartheid. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who you see pictured in the middle. Desmond Tutu was a bishop in the Anglican Church in South Africa. He wasn't like a Catholic bishop, but he kind of brought a religious perspective to the, I guess you could say, the protest against apartheid. And he wanted to have interracial reconciliation so that blacks and whites could get along. And for calling for this, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984. He would go on to live for several decades after that, but he was very pivotal in helping gain the freedom of Nelson Mandela, who had been in prison for over 25 years. So, 1983, Asian and coloreds in South Africa were given representation in South Africa's three-party system. If you were white, they still controlled the majority of the South African government. As you can see here, not necessarily full representation for all South Africans. So, Nelson Mandela, an ANC member who was imprisoned for over 20 years, was kind of deemed a terrorist at different times by the South African government, won his release from prison in 1987. And after his release, he kind of made it a point that he was going to try to run for political office and help establish maybe free elections for all South Africans. He would need some help. And so the man that you see in number 8 here, F.W. de Klerk, who was basically the last of the white leaders of South Africa. He helped in apartheid by releasing Nelson Mandela in 1987. He also reinstated the African National Council, and he allowed for the first non-racial election in the early 1990s. And as a result, he is going to be voted out of office, and Nelson Mandela will be elected president of South Africa. All right. There were other happenings that were not necessarily so good. In the early 1990s, there was a genocide that happened in the very small country of Rwanda. Rwanda is near the Nile River. It's kind of in what we would call maybe East Central Africa, kind of sub-Saharan Africa. This genocide was the result of ethnic differences. So you had a group of people known as the Hutu, who pretty much controlled power. A tribal group controlled power and encouraged the destruction of another group of people known as the Tutsis and some of the moderate Hutus. And so what ends up happening in 1994 is that there is this situation where Hutus start going after the Tutsis and the moderate Hutus, and we have just a very quick spreading genocide, a lot of terrorism, a lot of violence, and eventually you have some of the Tutsis that are fleeing, and we have a refugee crisis. Some of them are trying to get into the neighboring nation of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Others are trying to go anywhere they can find help. It's going to take a little bit of time to stabilize Rwanda. Rwanda today probably a little bit more stable than it was maybe 30 years ago. There were other dictatorships in Africa. Some of this was as a result of, winning independence from the British and the French. But those dictatorships, a lot of them were weakened following the Cold War because of the lack of funding that came from the United States and eventually the Soviet Union and other countries that had previously given money to the dictators who were kind of on their sides. Since independence, Africa has faced environmental challenges such as desertification, where desert-like conditions are spreading to areas that at once were kind of lush, farmable land, and this is contributing to problems with droughts and famines. Probably one of the biggest famines that we saw kind of prior to the year 2000 was a famine in Ethiopia. And that resulted in a lot of public attention, especially when entertainers got involved and started singing songs and making it a little bit more noticeable in the news. There were also other issues. The spread of HIV and AIDS has also challenged many African nations since independence. Only a small percentage of Africans with AIDS receive treatment due to a lack of education, but also due to a lack of infrastructure to deliver some of the medicines that are needed for treatment. And there's also a lack of money along with that. Again, there has been an outcry, and the United States over the years has helped send medicine to help combat this epidemic. And then there's other leaders. Idi Amin, who you see pictured here, he is known as the Butcher of Uganda. And he was a dictator kind of in the late 1970s, early 1980s, ruled with a lot of brutality. And unfortunately, he wasn't ruling alone. I mean, there were other brutal dictators, if we would have more time to kind of go into that, but he probably gets a little bit more attention because of just how awful a guy he was. Other issues. Ethnic violence plagued the region of Sudan, Africa's largest nation. And in the western province of Darfur, Arab militias in support of an Arab led government attacked nomadic Christians over the issue of water rights and access to the Nile River. And more than 200,000 people were killed, and more than 2 million people were made refugees. And a lot of this was happening in the kind of the late 90s, early 2000s. Some of them fled to neighboring countries of Ethiopia, adding to some of the troubles that they had. Others fled on foot and made it to places like Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. In the last several years, there was a move to divide Sudan, and so today there is South Sudan and Sudan. The old nation of Sudan is predominantly Arab-led. South Sudan is a little more moderate, with more representation of those nomadic Christians. Okay. In 2008, an international criminal court issued an arrest warrant for the Sudanese president Omar Hussein al-Bashir for the crimes that were committed during this humanitarian crisis. And in February of 2020, al-Bashir was handed over to The Hague, which is the court of NATO, and it's kind of tied a little bit to the UN, but it's probably more tied with NATO, to face charges. In 2011, South Sudan became an independent country. So thank you very much.